Okay, so yeah, I decided to do music on for this video. Because being a boring old man is only fun once in a while. Other than that, well, it becomes boring. So, anyways, we're gonna talk about totally not boring things. The quantity theory of money on Nyquil. Yeah, let's do it on Nyquil. So, yeah, we're gonna talk about the quantity theory of money. It's also known as the equation of exchange. And well, with that very, very brief intro, let's get a move on. So, the quantity theory of money is this right here: MV equals PY. The money supply, MT, multiplied by the velocity of money, or how fast money is changing hands, is equal to the price level times real output. So basically what this says is that the money supply multiplied by how fast money is changing hands is equal to nominal GDP, because nominal GDP is price times output, right? So the velocity of money, that V term, right, this VT, oh, excuse me, I had a little burp there, is also what's known as the Cambridge K. And it's expressed as this right here, where V is equal to 1 over the Cambridge K. So we can say the Cambridge K is the inverse of the velocity of money. But, I mean, surely it's got to have more of like an economic meaning or significance than that, right? Well, yeah, but this is how we would write it. So M would equal K times nominal GDP. And the Cambridge K reflects the ratio of total transactions to income and the ratio of desired money balances to money transactions. Now, that's just kind of a nice little aside. I don't think you'll be getting tested on the Cambridge K or anything like that. I'm going to be a little bit more concerned with the velocity of money, but it's just something that's nice to kind of see and know, like, oh, hey, cool, it's there. So let's talk about a special case of either the velocity of money or the Cambridge K. If the income elasticity of demand for money is equal to 1, and the interest rates have no effect on the demand for money, then K and V are constants. The income elasticity of demand is how much demand changes with respect to changes in income. And this elasticity basically tells us how sensitive the household is to changes in their demand for money if their income were to change by 1%. If the elasticity is 1, it means that the quantity of money demanded will also change by 1%. So what that means is it's like a 1-to-1 thing here, right? 1% change in income, 1% change in the demand for money. Now, at that point, when that happens, both the Cambridge K and V, the velocity of money, are constant, meaning they're time invariant. That will be something that's worth going back to in a couple of slides. So here what I did was I let somebody else plot out the evolution of the price level and the money supply for both the United States and the UK for the years 1900 to 1997. And if we look at this, we see something that's pretty interesting. We see that the price level and the money supply are pretty heavily correlated with each other, right? Meaning if there's a change to the money supply, there's probably going to be a change to the price level. And this seems to be going along with what we've been talking about in previous lectures about how, if we were to change the money, then the price level is probably going to do something. Well, if we look at it here, what we're seeing is that, yeah, there are some deviations from them, but for the most part, they're pretty heavily correlated. So, yeah, this does make some intuitive sense with what we were talking about earlier when it came to things like monetary neutrality. But you're probably going to be like, hey, Jeremy, that's long-run stuff, right? Well, yeah, sometimes. But what we can see here is that if we increase the money supply, we're going to be increasing prices. Because printing money doesn't mean that we just get more stuff, right? Because if we just print money, and that could mean we get more stuff, then why wouldn't we just print more money all the time? We don't, because that doesn't happen. So, let's look at how the quantity theory of money works mathematically, and it will kind of explain what's going on with that correlation between the growth in the money supply and prices. Remember, the quantity theory of money was this. And if we want to get the percent change of this thing over time, it's actually going to make it a lot easier for us. It's going to be a lot prettier to look at too. So what we do is I just take the percent change. I'm actually doing log differences, but with time series econometrics, log differences are the percent change. Now, the percent change does a couple of nice things. One, it tells me what the rate of change is rather than the level. Two, and this is the really nice thing, it's now additively separable. So instead of having to multiply stuff together, we can just add stuff together. And that's a little bit nicer for us. Now, if V is a constant, right, when the income elasticity of demand for money is equal to 1, V is a constant. And so if it's time invariant, right, the percent change of a time invariant variable, the percent change of a constant is 0. So that reduces that delta or that percent change VT to 0. And what I get now is that the percent change in the money supply is equal to the percent change in prices plus the percent change in real income. Now, once more, we can simplify a few things because that percent change in prices is equal to inflation. So the change in the money supply is equal to the inflation rate plus the growth rate of real income. And if I wanted to solve equation 7 for pi, all I do is just subtract that percent change in income, or the growth rate in income, and I get this right here. I get inflation being equal to the percent change in the money supply minus the percent change in real income. So, from this equation, it says if the income elasticity of demand for money is equal to 1, then the rate of change in the price level is equal to the rate of change in the money supply minus the rate of change in income. So on this relationship, now we actually have a way to tie in money growth with inflation. We can kind of see a nice theoretical explanation for how the change in money growth can lead to a change in inflation. And it will also provide some theoretical background for that graph that we saw of the change in money and the change in the price level. So if you remember that helicopter drop example that I gave, right? We dropped a bunch of money over this little economy, but no one really made any more stuff. Prices just went up. Now, in that case, the percent change in real income was 0 because there was no change to output. If we're not making any more stuff, how can we be earning any more? So, in other words, if the velocity of money is constant and output is constant, then the price level is just directly proportional to the initial quantity of money. Meaning, if percent change in V and percent change in Y are 0, what I get is that inflation is equal to the percent change in the money supply. Says that there would be no change in output, or if there's no change in output, any percentage change in the money supply leads to a similar magnitude increase in the rate of inflation, which, like I said, gives some theoretical support behind that graph of money and prices. However, there are times where changes in the money growth can change output, but we're going to talk a little bit more about this, one, in a future slide, and two, in a future lecture much later on in the course. So if there's output growth going on while the money supply is increasing, then what's going to happen is it's going to slow down that rate of inflation. Because if, say, the percent change in the money supply is 5% and the percent change in output is 0, we wanted to know what inflation was, we would just plug and play and we would get inflation is equal to 5%. Right? The inflation rate is equal to the rate of change in the money supply. However, if we were to let the percent change in the money supply still be 5%, but now we have income, the same thing. We have income growing at 3%, and we want to see what inflation is. Well, at this point, we also just plug and play with that equation, right? Inflation equals percent change in money minus the percent change in output. Plug that in, and what we see here is that we get 5% minus 3% equals 2%. So if we're getting a change in real income, right, or real production output, then that is going to be slowing down the rate of inflation if there is a change in the money supply. So if output grows, another burp there. If output grows, it's going to reduce the rate of inflation. If money grows, it increases the rate of inflation. So it says, can we see if this bears out in the data? I don't actually have the graph in this slideshow. My mistake. It is in the book. You can see it. There's a graph in the book. You can see in this section if it bears out in the data or not. And I'm just going to go ahead and give you a hint. The answer is yes, it does. So we can see that so far, I mean, it looks like a pretty good theory. Like, it's pretty awesome stuff. It tells us some pretty interesting things, but not everybody likes it. And just as a short little aside, this is kind of a common thing in econ. Not everyone's going to agree on a theoretical formula or empirical findings or anything like that. There's this long-standing joke that my uncle told me years ago of if you lined up every macroeconomist in the world, you couldn't get from here to a conclusion. And the older I get and the more I study macroeconomics, the more I see that he was completely on the money, and it's about as funny as it is depressing. Now, a lot of these debates are rarely partisan, right? It's not like, oh, you damn Republicans, or oh, damn Democrats, stupid Republicans, or whatever. It rarely is it that. They're usually mathematical in nature. It's more of a policy by policy basis. It's not like there's a political prior in there. It's just, okay, based on the evidence I have seen, based on the research I have done, what are the policy implications of this? So the arguments over certain schools of thought in macroeconomics aren't partisan. So if you hear about like Keynesian macroeconomic theory, Keynesian theory is not a partisan thing. There are both Democrats and Republicans that support Keynesian economic theory. In fact, almost all of them do. A very good example is like the COVID relief bills that have been coming out, right? Those are very, very, very Keynesian in nature, because the Keynesian approach to this was basically, okay, if there is a slump in the business cycle, then we can use fiscal policy to inject money into the economy to prevent the business cycle from dipping as low as it would otherwise. So if there is slack demand, basically government spending can try to re-stimulate demand and sort of stabilize some of these large fluctuations in the business cycle. What do you think those $1,200 COVID relief checks were? So these things aren't usually partisan. A lot of times they're made to sound partisan, but they're not. And that was probably like a 2-minute rant on this stuff. Maybe that'll be useful to you one day. I hope to God it is. But there's a lot of different ways to test a lot of these different theories, and there are ways to test even the quantity theory of money. Depending on how they're tested, depending on how the models are set up, what data is used, how they're identified, right? What some of the structural forms are that you want to impose on the models, well, it's going to give us different results. And if we get different results, we're going to get different implications for the validity of the theory. And so there's a couple of critiques of the quantity theory of money that I want to talk about here. The first one is like a causal path. Critics of the quantity theory of money have basically argued that all the factors in the equation are interrelated. We can say that these variables are endogenous to one another, right? A shock to the money supply may cause a different set of responses than, say, a shock to just the price level, right? A shock to the money supply, as we will see later on in the course, a shock to the money supply is going to trigger an aggregate demand shock, right? But a shock to the price level would be an aggregate demand shock. However, it would have some slightly different responses than what we would see with a shock to the money supply. A shock to output, right, a positive shock to output could either be a demand shock or a supply shock, depending on the direction that prices go. If we assume that there's a positive shock to output and a negative shock to prices, well, that is going to cause a different set of responses than what a shock to the money supply would cause. So we can see that there's different sets of responses depending on which variable really hits first. Now, if we were to order these things, they usually go from the slowest to the fastest moving variables. So we would have the velocity of money, the money supply, the price level, and finally output, right? So it'd be like ordered by the velocity first, money second, price third, output fourth. This would imply some kind of a causal ordering of shocks. And we'll kind of look at this a little bit later when we sort of learn how this stuff is supposed to work. But this is a pretty important thing, especially when we're looking at business cycle models. And it's my goal that the last half, maybe even more than the last half, will be spent primarily on business cycle models, because that's where we can really apply some of this monetary theory and really see how monetary policy works, and then be able to apply that to real world stuff, which, given what's going on right now with COVID-19, is actually pretty fascinating. It's really something that we're going to want to, pay attention to and think about and go, how is this supposed to work? Now, another criticism is this guy Keynes that I talked about, Keynesian economics and all that, John Maynard Keynes, which I always get his name confused with the lead singer from Tool, because his name is like Maynard James Keenan or something like that. I don't even know if you guys know who the band Tool are. But for some stupid reason, I can't ever get their names like unconfused. So I always have to like take a second if I say Keynes' full name. So sometimes just say Keynes. Keynes argued that a change in the money supply may not lead to an increase in the price level. His argument is, if the economy's in a recession, it has unemployed resources. Capital and labor used in production aren't being fully utilized. So if it has these unemployed resources, expansionary monetary policy could lead to more employment, thus more output, right? And there are some valid explanations for this. Keynes was kind of right. He wasn't fully right, as we will learn later on. But this is an argument that Keynes made that has some merit. If we're in a slump, right, if the economy's in a slump, an increase in the money supply could possibly lead to a larger increase in output than prices or inflation, however you want to think about it. But when we're closer to our productive capacity, an increase in the money supply will lead to a larger increase in prices or inflation than an increase in output. So basically, if you want to think about this, right, we were talking about the Phillips curve and how the Phillips curve related inflation and unemployment. We can also think of the Phillips curve for output, which relates inflation with output rather than unemployment. And if we think about the Phillips curve for output, it's going to have a flat region and then a very steep region. And if you look at this graph here, right, I've got this vertical line at this point, YT star. Everything to the left of that vertical line is going to suggest that output is more responsive than price. So if there were a monetary policy shock, which triggers an aggregate demand shock, aggregate demand would move along this Phillips curve for output. Because if you look at the vertical and horizontal axes, we've got price and output, basically. Well, that's just supply, right? In this case, it's aggregate supply. The Phillips curve for output is aggregate supply. So along this Phillips curve for output, there's a flat region and a steep region. In this flat region, if there's a demand shock, output would increase much more than prices would. However, to the right of that purple line, we see price begins to get more responsive than output. Why is that? Well, we only have finite resources in the economy. And with finite resources in the economy, we can only make so much stuff at any one point in time. And as we're getting closer and closer and closer to where we are tapping out and we don't have any unemployed resources anymore, we can't make any more, right? If you aren't working at all, and I give you even like $15 to go do something, right? $15 to grade exams for me. Well, you're probably going to do it. If you're working, say, 10 hours a day and I offer you $15, you're probably going to go, I don't think so. But if I offer you like $50, you'll go, you know what? Okay, yeah, I could use an extra $50, right? But if you're working 22 hours a day, right, you get 2 hours to go home and sleep. You're probably not getting very much sleep. and then I come to you and say, hey, do you mind spending a good 5 hours grading this exam for me? You're going to go, dude, I don't have the time. I don't care how much you pay me. I don't have the time. I'm already working. My resources are already being employed. That's kind of what's happening here. So when output is more responsive than price, Keynes's critique of the quantity theory of money would actually hold because, well, if we can trigger an aggregate demand shock via monetary policy expansion, then as the aggregate demand curve shifts along this aggregate supply, or this Phillips curve for prices curve, we would see output respond much more than price. But if the economy is not in a recession and it's doing really well, right, the economy is, quote, hot, then what's going to happen is if we try to trigger an aggregate demand shock, well, all that you would see is an increase in inflation because, well, productive capacity is already tapped out. Now, another criticism is with the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. The best way to describe the transmission mechanism of monetary policy is the path that monetary expansion takes in order to affect the real economy. There are multiple transmission mechanisms. There are more transmission mechanisms of monetary policy than there are subgenres. Trust me, I know a lot about both. One way monetary policy could work would be via driving down long-term bond yields. If the Federal Reserve buys long-term bonds, right, they're going to drop the yield on those bonds. Investors holding these bonds are going to shift the holdings of their portfolio from government bonds into equity markets, and you will see increases in stock prices, which is kind of funny because this is being recorded on January 27th, 2021, with that whole Reddit fiasco, which is just, to me, is just absolutely hilarious. I hope YouTube doesn't kill my video for that or anything. But anyways, yeah, getting past all that hilarity, if you shift your holdings from government bonds into equity markets, well, you'll drive equity prices up, and you can actually stimulate economic activity that way via what's known as a portfolio rebalance channel, or these are portfolio rebalance effects. You can also have monetary policy impact real economic activity via signaling channels. Now, a signaling channel would work by the Federal Reserve coming out, the chairperson coming out, which actually today on January 27th, 2021, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell came out and he gave an announcement about the plan to keep interest rates between 0 and 25 basis points for basically the foreseeable future, which is altering the expected future path of short-term interest rates. By changing expectations of the future path of these interest rates, they can be driving economic activity that way. There are also bank lending channels, right? If banks get more liquidity, they can lend more out. If they can lend more out, right, then boom, it can transmit to the economy that way. Because if you lend more money out to firms that are looking to invest, they're going to get the money that they're borrowing, and then they're going to invest that in stuff, and then boom, you can see changes in real economic activity that way. So if it goes through different channels, well, it may not just be like this one-to-one thing with prices and inflation. It will in the long run, yes, but in the short run, maybe not. And because we don't have any way to really identify any particular transmission mechanisms of monetary policy, the quantity theory can't really account much for that. There's a reason why the quantity theory is like a nice teaching tool, and I mean, it is used in some more advanced dynamic macro stuff, but it doesn't end there. It goes well beyond that into like dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which I'll cover. You won't have to solve them, but you'll kind of see what they look like and what they do, and it's pretty interesting, I think. But yeah, the quantity theory can't really account for that. So if it can't account for that, then, well, we're going to have a little bit of an issue on our hands. Another reason that the quantity theory might not, stand up to a lot of scrutiny at times would be inactive balances. If people are hoarding their money under the bed because, damn it, they haven't trusted the bank since the crash of 29, well, Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty self-explanatory. The money is in circulation. Still counted in the money supply because it's still out there, right? But it's not going anywhere. You're just sitting on it. You're not doing anything with this money. So it can lead to this theory to kind of break down a little bit, as the money in circulation is not the same as the stock of money that exists. So it's kind of like a measurement problem here. So if you want this theory to work, don't hide money in the walls of your house. I actually know someone who's done that. Now, this wraps up the talk on the quantity theory of money. Next, we're going to talk about expected inflation and then the optimal quantity of money, probably 2 separate lectures. And that will wrap up the demand and supply for money. And we'll start like other cool new things. So until next time, have a great weekend.